say if I started to work with you and I was doing a lot more of this work that was fascially driven, I guess, as far as the way that you approach movement and the systems you have, I shouldn't be throwing out my chiropractor or my soft tissue therapist or my therapist or us. Like if it works for you, it works for you, and whether you're doing your style training or not, it doesn't really
100%. And like here's a really easy example of that too. Deep tissue work, deep tissue massage. Who needs deep tissue massage? Well, everybody, right? Everyone needs it to a degree. But we look at that as being something that is only sought out for when we're sore, when we're exhausted, when we have an injury. So we think, okay, I just had knee surgery, I should probably go get some tissue work around the knee. So we're very reactive in that regard. But I think that if we look at those as being essentially like support elements to performance, and again, whether you're general population or an elite athlete, budget, cost, accessibility not included here, I think that those things are all extremely beneficial and things that should be done proactively as opposed to reactively. It's something I've kind of ascribed to is that recovery and restoration, when it's done reactively, isn't recovery or restoration.
Yeah. Speaking of recovery, what kind of is there a different timeline to sort of the response? Like a two-part question. The athletes that you've worked with, and you're really good at asking questions, I feel, and when you work with your athletes and they give you feedback, what are they kind of feeling? And maybe it's as opposed to a traditional lifting session compared to what you might do with them, what are they feeling? And is there any difference in timeline for recovery or what they can expect, or even what they can and can't do that day or the next day?
So for the user input, they probably think that I'm full of crap early on. This guy's just making things up to be entertaining. But, we've touched on it a couple of different times throughout these video modules. But the one thing that I do take serious pride in, I really do, it does mean a lot to me that they feel better. Whether it's a tight hamstring, whether it's an operated shoulder, they feel better. So I think that the important part of that is that feeling better creates the psychological environment to actually get better. And with our world and our industry specifically becoming so heavily driven by tech, data, biotech and wearables, all those things are fantastic. But if we lose the human element of what we do, then our job no longer really has much value or meaning in my mind, right? So the feel is a big one. Sensation of pain coming down, pretty consistently with that. And I think intriguing and interesting and fun and engaging, would kind of be the third most common points of feedback that I get. And again, that kind of ties back to that initial point of yes, we need to objectively improve things. I'm well aware of that. But at the same time, if I can get people even fractionally more excited or incentivized to train and doing good quality things, I think that's a massive win. And it kind of forms that environment to develop a good platform to build from. To the second part, the timeline is interesting, and it was really interesting the way you worded that, because I do think that there is a little bit more of a learning curve to this. Not because it's anything other than a little bit different, but when people come into a gym, they come in with a very clear expectation or connotation as to what they're getting ready to undertake. For an example, for me, it would be if I go into a financial manager, I have a very clear vision of what I think that would be like. I don't know anything about money. So I can create whatever, envision that I have. But when you come in expecting something and then it's totally different, that, gives you a little bit longer learning curve, but does come with excitement and interest. So I think the timeline early on is the movement literacy period, which is something that I do really ascribe to, where I want to teach and show and allow them to feel things that we're going to eventually be loading or we're eventually going to be, doing with frequency throughout the programming. And then once we kind of get that initial literacy phase out of the way, things start to move pretty quickly. And once they feel some of these certain angles or these different combination patterns, a couple of times, then we can start to kind of pick up and go. Now, in terms of the physical responses to things, I don't believe that there is quite the same level of strain demand as we would see if we compared it to something polar opposite, like a 5-3-1. So I think that, it allows athletes, and this is probably even more especially true for Gen Pop, to create a continuum of training, because they don't feel like they have this, exhaustive recovery getting back to baseline. Now, if we're talking about the elite athletes, this is probably a little bit of a different conversation, but for most, again, because we're not pushing so hard on the compounding volume, because it's not very much compressive load, if any at all, and because we are always essentially microdosing, right? It's always total body with some little element of focus. It kind of blends that stress out evenly enough to where we can kind of go back to back, and we can do moderate to high intensity loading with appropriate volume, and not having the delayed soreness and stiffness. Yeah.
Speaking about adaptation, as a therapist, and I would say that I've been engaged in fascia for a long time, probably almost definitely not at the same level that you've read. I know that I've read, and a lot of people talk about the slowness of fascia adapting, and that it adapts slower than muscle does. Is that a consideration with the work you do, or is it only in that kind of purely structural, almost postural sort of thing?
I think it's really important to bifurcate that into two different points, because I attached to that thinking early on as well, because we read 1 to 2 years for fascial remodeling and things like that, and it's a slower collagen turnover and all the physiological properties that come with it, but the sensory adaptation occurs quickly. And if we keep this on the track of the fascial sensory motor properties, I think a lot of it goes to interoception and kinesthesia. So interoception meaning my body's awareness of where my body is, how I feel about how I feel. And again, kind of going back to that literacy component where, we're teaching things that people have done, but we're doing it in just a little bit of a different way, or we're, looking at a specific angle or position. There's a coordination process that we got to get through, and that's this interoceptive and proprioceptive aptitude. So I think this sensory piece happens pretty quickly. And I don't want to speak too much on this, because I don't, it's not my scope or ability to do so, but I think that there's a similar response or aptitude with the nociceptive response as well.
Sure.
Especially when we have things like non-specific low back pain. If somebody's coming off of an ACL tear, that's a different situation.
Sure.
But somebody who's just chronically tight hamstrings, chronically, tight low back, I think we can get those things cleaned up pretty quickly. Now, for the adaptations on the more physical side and the remodeling and the collagen turnover and remodeling as well, that is a longer process that over time, we're competing against multiple variables. So, if we're thinking about specifically, adaptation specific to the fascial lines, right? How long did they spend doing compound bilateral structural loading? Where are they within their playing or their sport career? Those things are going to be considerable factors. If I have a 14-year-old kid, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be a 1 to 2 year process. If I have a 38-year-old man, retired athlete, it's probably going to be a little bit of a longer window. But there's absolutely ability to make transient and short-term change. I think that the tissue viscosity is another one that we can make acute changes on pretty quickly. The tissue elasticity and the stiffness properties, those are the aspects that are probably going to be several months, if not a year plus. Yeah.
So if I'm not getting sore from the training, and if there's that feeling of feeling better almost immediately afterwards, rather than getting driven down and just completely wiped out after a session, should I be doing it more often? Do you give you guys homework to sort of reinforce a lot of the stuff you're doing with them in person, one-on-one?
Conceptually, yes. Yeah. I think to kind of touch on that first part, I think that that's another serious misconstruction, especially from the athlete perspective, that if I'm not broken down, if I'm not exhausted, if I don't, if I can't get up off of the toilet without assistance, then I didn't do a good workout. Unequivocally untrue. Unequivocally untrue, especially when we're talking about elite athletes. If me and you were tasked to pack up everything in this house and put it into a moving truck, I'd wake up tomorrow with my chest hurting because of the lung capacity that I don't have, and I'd be sore in places that I didn't know existed. Soreness is just indication of doing something or exposing your body to something that it's not accustomed to. That's it, right? So if we experience soreness in training, whether we're talking on the fascial side or we're talking on the conventional side, that's all that it is. It's just exposure to volume, intensity, or movement that we haven't done. So because the essence of fascial-based training is more, emphasized on motor patterning, the coordination of movement, seaming different movements together, being able to move in different velocities and planes, I think that there just isn't enough of the redundancy that we see in a conventional model that produces that same, sensation, so to speak. So that's really where, we start to get into, like, what is the situation that we're handling right now. And if we stick to just kind of like a general sense here, I think that I try to train 3 or 4 days a week, and I try to exercise every day. And so with the fascial-based concepts, it becomes very easy to do that, right? So basically 3 or 4 days, we're going to load and work and push and really try to, reach those points of fatigue. And then the other 2 or 3 days, I want to feel good. Like, I'm 33 now. So even though I'm the youngest one of this bunch, I'm starting to get some of those,
What kind of low blow was that, by the way?
Hey, I'm quick, man.
I'm the one hobbling around.
But I want to go in and I want to do something that makes me feel good, feel better, not take an hour and a half, and then, get a little bit of a light sweat and keep pushing.